All right. This morning we're going to take a look again into 1 Corinthians 11. And as you know, this is in the context of Paul writing to a church that was very selfish, hard to imagine. And Paul's had to write them two or three occasions because of the problems that this church was having. And so they asked him some questions and he's giving them some answers. And we're in a larger section that's dealing with a variety of issues. And so we saw how Paul tried to clarify the issue of the meat sacrificed to idols. That's a problem inside of a cultural context. So we needed to understand a little bit about the culture so we could understand the problem that Paul was addressing. And then he talked about head coverings of all things. And it was not so much the nature of the head covering, or if it was made out of this or made out of that, or long hair, longer hair, longest hair, whatever that was. That's the superficial side. But the question is one of, in the sense of submission and orderliness inside the church. And so Paul had to talk to them about that. And then he began, as we saw last time, to talk to them about the Lord's Supper. Once again, people acting badly. I guess would be the name of this church acting badly, because they were selfish. They were harming one another. And we saw that this is contained inside a larger section. So it began with men and women leading in worship, and it's going to end with women and men in worship. And in between, he's going to talk about the order of worship, the spiritual gifting for worship, and right in the middle, in the yellow section there, it's all about love. Because this was the problem for the church. Selfish, meism, me. I want what I want. And that was in terms of where they went to dinner. That was in terms of how they went to dinner at the Lord's Supper. That was in terms of how they went to worship in church. It was all about my self-autonomy, my own authority. And Paul says, listen, my friends, the Lord has some words for us, but the center point has to do with love. And these folks missed it. So Paul's going to get a whole chapter to talk about it once we get to it, but we're not there yet. But this kind of lets you see that Paul very clearly had in his mind where he was going and trying to write it in a very literary way so that they would remember. And he signposts things for us by saying, now in this I will praise you, and in this I will not praise you. Can you imagine a pastor talking like that to his people? Now, folks, what you've been doing this week up is really, really good. I'm really happy. I'm pleased to be your pastor. But you know, last week you did this and you're jerks. What's wrong with you? I'm not happy about this. I can't praise you for that. This is wrong. Let me tell you why you're wrong. Can you imagine a pastor talking like that? That's almost unheard of. Why? Because they're trying to keep their job. They're trying to keep everybody happy. And unfortunately, we sometimes compromise or we pocket our principles when the pressure's on. And Paul obviously didn't have that problem because he's very easy to say, nope, can't praise you for that, but I can praise you for this. So he's very open and honest and transparent. Now remember, this is all in the context of the super apostles. Remember them? The second generation apostles, they weren't, but they claimed to be. And the Corinthians were starting to go, well, we like their message a little bit better than this guy Paul. Well, they don't bug us as much as Paul. Well, Paul's so moralistic, he's telling us we're wrong. He's telling us he won't praise us. Maybe these other guys are better, and Paul will have none of that, and he's going to deal with that a little bit later. So at any rate, Paul is writing to them about instructions, about traditions, about how to keep order, and he is not shy about it. And he says at the end of this whole thing, he says, when I get there, I'll tell you some more. So this is how I do it in the church, and I'm telling you how it is, and when I get there, I'm going to tell you a whole lot more. So this is a church that had a problem. The problem was division, and the principle was unity. And so Paul, once again, as we've seen before, Paul is going to give biblical truth. He is then going to bring it into a theological statement, and then it's going to become ethical behavior. Again, this is what the church needs to do today. We need to study our Bible. We need to then bring it together in theological constructs to speak to these issues. And then we need to make ethical decisions about, so how do we respond to whatever's going on in the culture today? Unfortunately, again, many churches, people don't talk about this. They don't talk about what is the theology of immigration. What is the theology of climate control? What is the theology of when do you submit to your government and if and when you ever don't? We don't talk about that. We need to talk about it because these issues are on the table. And so it's one thing to say, well, I just teach the Bible. Well, good. But look what Paul does when he teaches what we call now the Bible. He gives theological lessons, and he gives ethical lessons, and he's not shy about it. And one of the reasons that the church has lost the culture war is because it's been either shy or incompetent.
I was listening to a pastor the other day, and I can't think of his name. He's a Nigerian guy, really long message. I listened to bits and pieces of it. And he was talking exactly about what you're talking about right now. Just how the church has just stepped away from not even talking about politics, not even talking about the things that are happening in our world that are unethical. And look at the mess that we're in. And he's from Nigeria. He's like looking into the fishbowl, right? And I mean, his country too has issues, same thing. So
there are some folks, some pastors, leaders, whatever, who think you're not supposed to talk about, quote, politics.
yeah,
Now, depending on how you define politics, I would agree. But if you define politics by what the word means, not a blood-sucking animal like a tick,
yeah.
but as people who are leading people in a city, the polis, multiple people trying to govern people, you have to talk about this. The Apostle Paul does, John does, Peter does. Why don't we? So to say we shouldn't talk about political issues is incorrect. We need to. In fact, one day a few years ago, I made some statements in our class about voting. I said, number one, I think Christians should vote. And number two, you have to make a decision. Now, the good news is you have two platforms, this platform, that platform. Don't even look at the men who are being looked at to run the platform, look at the platform. Now, as you look at the platform, it seemed pretty obvious if Jesus was choosing platforms and he had to choose one or the other, he'd probably choose this, but that's up to you. That's it. I didn't tell you who to vote for. I didn't tell you whatever. So evidently somebody was bothered. They didn't come to me. They went to Andy and told him that I told everybody to vote for Donald Trump. Well, that's a lie. That wasn't true. I said, Andy, that's a lie. That's not true. This is what I said. And I'd sure appreciate it if you, next time somebody tells you something else, come to me again, or tell them to have the courage to come to me, as well. But the bottom line is, it's okay to talk about these things because the Bible does. Okay? I mean, so that's my view, that's my opinion. If I get in trouble, I'll tell Jace, he'll come to me and tell me I'm wrong. Okay, we'll go from there. But that's how I see it.
Yeah, of course, we're fixing to go to Washington, D.C. for the celebration. But one of the things I read, one of the reasons I wanted to go to the Capitol, I believe what I read was walking with 3 statues of 3 preachers. And back during the Revolution, they went up and down the 13 colleges preaching about freedom, resisting religion. So our country was formed with preachers preaching politics.
Absolutely. They were preaching ethical principles that happen to bleed into people. Well, then that's the connection with people and the Bible. That's political. Of course.
This morning on the news, they were interviewing these kids from these classical schools and classical Christian schools, learning about Greek and all this stuff and how it intertwines with what's happening with our history today. And it was so neat to hear those kids talk. I mean, it just was incredible.
But the devil's attacked our education system as
Exactly.
well as our family system. And so the roots, they're like a cut flower. It still looks nice up top, but the roots have been severed. It's only a matter of time before the bloom dies. Well, now we don't want to be negative. Let's move on. We don't want to get too much. The problem with the Corinthians is they had division, right? They had some tension. They were schizoid, so to speak. They were divided, and the problem was they were selfish. And Paul has listed this even before. Remember in chapter 1, this was still their problem. And so even now, a little bit later here in the book, in chapter 11, they still have issues of division. They still have issues of splintering, whether it's choosing sides, but in this case, it was a sociological splintering. They were choosing sides based on social status, wealth, power. So Paul's going to communicate to them, But always remember, when you read your Bible, it's contained in terms of the culture. Everything we read, there's a cultural shroud around it, so we have to understand the culture a little bit. And we saw last time, in terms of the Lord's Supper, we are all equal in Christ, right? There's neither male or female, slave or free, or whatever. We're equal because we all were lost. We become saved the same way. When Bob goes and shares the gospel, whether it's some kids in a truck or some old lady here or some old man there, it's the same message, because the same people have the same problem, hell. And this one message gets them out of hell. So we're all equal in that sense. But equity is a different thing. Equity has to do with, well, you got $10 and I got $30. So that's not equity. I mean, equity, are we supposed to make sure, well, let's just split it all so we're even? That's called communism, right? And it hasn't worked lately. Even though people think it has. The only thing communism accomplishes is the murder of millions and millions of people. That's where it's consistent, unfortunately. But in terms of the gospel, we are all equal. But at the Lord's Supper, Paul was saying, let's put away the sociology. Stop shaming people. Stop honoring the rich. Stop shaming the poor. And eat your dinner before you get there, so you don't eat all the food before the slave people get there and don't have any food. They're embarrassed, not to mention them. So they were not treating the Lord's Supper properly. Part of the reason was they didn't understand the idea of what is sacred. This was not just another meal. This was a special meal. And so, as we saw last week, as David Garland said, the Lord's Supper should accent and intensify group solidarity, unity. The Corinthian Supper accented and intensified social differences. No one ought to feel humiliated at the Lord's Supper, yet the Corinthians' manner of conducting the meal left the have-nots feeling that they were beneath the notice of their fellow Christians. Primary issue is their conduct surrounding the Lord's Supper, and Paul appeals to the Last Supper tradition to correct it. So the problem here was social climbing, social clinging, wanting to be with our kinds of people. So one day, a long time ago, in just the world far, far away, I was a young guy. I was a Christian. And I went to Peninsula Bible Church with Ray Stedman. This is like the original Bible church. This is Haight-Ashbury time, Jesus people time. This is way back then, which was really bizarre. And so that's one picture. So to kind of get outside of that, because I was an atheist before I became a Christian, I was in a non-Christian family, so I had no idea what church was or any of that stuff. So it's the Bible church. So one day I go over to Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. Now, Menlo Park is probably one of the wealthiest areas in the universe, and probably rivaling Highland Park here in Dallas, Texas. And so I go to this Presbyterian church, very well known, very lofty. So there I am, and I'm in my normal dress, a t-shirt, and blue jeans. That's what you wore in church at Peninsula Bible Church. So I went there, and it was a very crowded church, a big building and all that. Ours was in a barn-like thing, but big building we went into. And so I got in line, and they were welcoming people, and this old lady was there, and she had on her suit, very nice. And she was welcoming everybody. Oh, hi, good to have you with us this morning. And then she came to me. Oh, hello, good morning. I just turned on to the next person.
Oh my
I
goodness.
didn't acknowledge that I exist. Well, I obviously wasn't valued as a valuable person there, right? But that was kind of a social climbing church I learned. And Paul would say, that's not what we want. You might be rich, you might be poor. And Paul's not saying give away all your money. He is saying, when we come to the Lord's Supper, leave that at the door. Forget that. We are all equal in Christ. And at the Lord's Supper, there better be equity. There better be fairness in every way. And to not do that was a significant problem. So Paul says, you all are shaming people, and that's not a good thing. It was causing selfishness and division. Now, let's pick up the story. We're in chapter 11. And we got to verse 23 or to 22. After he's reprimanded them, I will not praise you at the end of 22. And then in verse 23, we pick up the story. For, now Paul's going to say, let me explain to you the significance of what I've been talking to you about. Let me explain to you the sacredness of the Lord's Supper. You all just haven't seen it, and you're just acting like secularized people. You don't understand the sacredness of this event. So Paul says, now let me explain this. For, verse 23, I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now, we do that once a month. Some churches do that every week. Some churches do it every quarter. Some people do it at Christmas and Easter, right? Or whenever they go to church. So here's a church. They would come, they would celebrate, they would take the bread, and they would have the full meal, and then they would have the cup after the meal. Now, there are a lot of kind of writings that summarize how it went during the first century and all that, and they're mostly similar. What Paul's doing is writing these instructions to these people. He's giving them advice. He's giving them, in a sense, the truth of the matter, and he wants them to understand it and receive it. So when he gave thanks, right? Now, some people call this the Eucharist, right? Giving thanks. So the idea of giving thanks is one word, two word giving thanks, to capture the whole event. Okay. Usually Catholics call it the Eucharist, we call it communion, or some people call it the Lord's Supper. Verse 24, there you might have a different Bible translation. So in the King James, it says, this is my body broken for you. Right? Some translations don't have the word broken. But the key here is, do this in remembrance of me. Yes, Bob?
But his body was not broken.
Well, actually, it's not just a translation, it's textual history. Some would say that the text has this extra word in it, and translating the word would be broken. But you're saying because his bones weren't broken on the cross. Right. So I think what they would say is metaphorically broken in the sense that he died. But I mean, you're right. They weren't physically broken. In fact, it goes out of the way to show us that the legs weren't broken, right? That's what you're referring to. Absolutely.
My translation says, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. Said,
The bread.
Yeah, my body was free.
Right. So you see, there's a little bit of textual question. That doesn't mean question your Bible. That doesn't mean it's any bad thing going on here. Just a matter of certain manuscripts have certain words in different places. But the key is, it's for you, right? This is a great theology that Paul talks about. There we go, got that going. Yes, this is that our sin is imputed to him, and all of his righteousness is imputed to us. This is that great exchange. This is what this represents. You were dead, and so he takes that from you. In fact, Bob quoted the Bible verse, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That's what this is all about. He's broken for us so that we don't have to be broken. This is the great exchange. And all of this can take place because of who he is and what he did. And so the Father saw that and said, great, sin has been propitiated, to use Romans 3. The propitiation, now we don't use that word a whole lot, but it simply means to avert wrath. It's taking the wrath away. Some would translate it expiation, similar, but the bottom line is the exchange took place, and I'm no longer guilty. What a selfless act on Jesus' part. And here the Corinthians are being selfish and getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, which was a problem. So words like substitution or the sacrifice or redemption, all these terms are wrapped up in this event. His body was given for us so that we don't have to suffer the consequences. That's a great message. Now, of course, most people are going to say, and what's that going to cost me? How much? How much? Zero. No, I'm Catholic. It's got to cost me something. No. Well, I'm Buddhist. I got to work. No. Well, I'm just American. I got to be able to do something to get this and earn it, so I can say I got it and earned it. No. You got to get people lost before you get them saved. And you got to help them understand it's free, and that's sometimes the hardest thing for people to understand. Free. I know, but what's it cost? It's free. I know it's free, but how much does it cost? What don't you understand about free? Free is free. We don't get that.
Well, I had a really good conversation with my best friend one time about this exact subject. And if we don't believe in free grace and we don't believe it's free, why did Jesus even die for us? It would cheapen everything. You know,
So this is a stumbling block. It seems like, are you kidding me? Why would receiving a free gift be a stumbling block? Because of our pride. So, as Marty Collins put it, he who is infinite suffered finitely, so that we who are finite might not suffer infinitely. Is this great? Is this not good news? Isn't this the news you bought? Wrong word. Isn't this the news you received? Isn't this the word you took in? Right? Now, and in doing this, Paul says, as we do this, we'll go back a little bit, but this is all about proclaiming the death of the Lord. Paul talks about this idea of death, both in the Corinthians work as well as other places. But this whole event is supposed to emphasize the death, but it obviously is going to imply the resurrection, and it's going to talk about him coming again. And that's what Paul's actually trying to get us to in 1 Corinthians 15. That seems to be kind of the peak of the book, is to get us there to understand those major doctrines that Paul wants us to focus on, not tongues, not prophecy, not just, selfishness here, division, but let's keep our focus on the death and resurrection and ascension and the coming again and the kingdom, and the Son will give his kingdom up to the Father, and God will be all in all. That's where this book is going to get us to. The magnificent glory of God, and they're here getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. And Paul's going, what kind of fools am I dealing with? Another regular. That's all.
I'll say, if I was God, I'd make you
Well,
work
but
for
you're
it.
not. Make sure.
I'd make you work for it, but that's what people do, is they try to make God in their image rather than understand the image of God, which is grace and love and merciful.
Right.
So when somebody said you gotta work, I say, your God's in your image, you don't understand God.
So Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. So we're supposed to remember this event from Luke 22, which actually took place in the Gospel of Jesus. Here, Paul is reminding the Corinthians, who may have heard Luke 22 or may not, but Paul's bringing it to their mind, saying, you need to remember this, because Jesus said, remember this. Now, the irony is, some people drink to forget. We drink to remember, right? Exactly. The Corinthians were getting drunk and out of their mind. Paul says, no, we're not drinking to get out of our mind. We're drinking to remember what Jesus did. And it is not much different today. You got all kinds of people drinking to forget, drinking to anesthetize themselves from their guilt, their shame, or whatever. No, drink this, but I'm not good enough. Exactly, you're not good enough. Well, but I haven't done enough. Exactly, you can't do enough. It's meant for sinners. Yeah, but people don't. Oh, well, that's why we just keep telling them. Because remember, this is a supernatural deal. The Holy Spirit's the one who has to draw men to himself. Not me. When they reject me or when they reject Bob, they reject. That's nothing. We've done our work when we share the gospel, period. God's the one who draws men and women to himself. We just need to proclaim a clear presentation. Now, when we talk about communion, we enter into a very interesting discussion, because This is one of the ordinances. Wait a minute, isn't this a sacrament? Is there a difference between an ordinance and a sacrament? Well, let's have a little fun. So if you're a Quaker, you don't have any, right? Or if you're what's called an ultra dispensationalist, you don't have any because you don't really attach anything for the church until after Acts 28. And after Acts 28, there's kind of the end of the story. So we won't go there. We're Protestants, so we tend to hold it to, right? Baptism, right? Baptism, Lord's Supper. Grace, brethren, some, not all, but many. And then Mennonites tend to add foot washing, right? Jesus, John 13, the foot washing, they say this is something we should normally do every week. We wash each other's feet to show how we're cleansing. And some turn that into being on par with the other two. I don't think I do, but some do. And then Roman Catholics have 7, a nice round number, and all of these are the way of dispensing grace. This is how you get the stuff. This is how you get coverage of your sin. You go to confession, yes, but you also do these other things to kind of take care of your sin problem.
What's extreme unction?
When you die, the priest comes over and says,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, last rites.
Oh, yeah.
Last rites. In parlance, it's extreme unction. So we're Protestants. And so if you're a Catholic, like the Council of Trent, a sacrament is something presented in the sense which has the power by divine institution, not only of signifying, but also efficiently conveying grace. It actually is the vehicle, the tool to convey grace. So you get grace when you're saved, but you get more grace, and then you get more grace through these activities, you get more grace. Now, we tend to not talk about it as a quote sacrament, because that kind of gets us muddied up with the Catholic Church. We talk about it as an ordinance. And Dr. Cook says an ordinance is a right ordained or commanded of God to be observed as a symbol, keyword, of some theological reality, rather than as an actual means of bringing grace to an individual. So in direct opposition to the sacramental side of it is an ordinance. If you don't like the word ordinance, call it something else, whatever. But we tend to practice 2, and we do them publicly, right? We have public baptisms, and we have public taking of the Lord's Supper. We do baptisms regularly. We do the Lord's Supper regularly. So this is what Protestants tend to do.
Want to witness to the world that you've been saved, be baptized. If you want to witness to the world that you're still in the church, make the Lord's Supper. It's a witness to the world.
Yeah, and imagine the first century, right? A little more or today, but I mean, closer type communities as opposed to Dallas and blah, blah, all this tight community. So when you did here, people knew it. Word traveled fast, right? It's better than Dallas Morning News. So, sure.
It seems like in the in the early days of the church that the Lord's Supper included a full meal.
We did.
And today we don't even come close to it.
Most
Are you
churches
going to
don't.
address that, or is that something that?
No, the answer is yes, it includes a full meal, and yes, most churches don't do that. Some churches do. Most Protestant churches don't. So the question is, should they? Are we commanded to do that? I don't know if we're commanded to have the full meal, but that's the model. And there's certainly nothing wrong with it. And many churches, not many, but some churches would say the believers gathering really is Sunday night for the teaching and the word and the sharing and communion. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. The only danger of any of this is it becomes ritualized. And when anything becomes ritualized, then you got a problem. But it doesn't have to be ritualized. So I'd be in favor of a meal with communion, absolutely. But I don't think our church has ever done that. The closest kind of what we did, we used to have the Wednesday night potluck, Wednesday night dinner, and people would come together and whatever, but it wasn't communion. So it wasn't what you're talking about, but we used to have meals. But I'd be totally in favor of that.
Well, it seemed like in churches I'd gone to where they had a meal, especially on a Wednesday. Meet on Wednesday. They may gather for a meal, then afterwards celebrate the Lord's Supper, right, with the breaking of the bread and wine.
Right.
But it seems like in the early church, it was, they broke the bread,
And
they had a meal, and then followed.
and most churches don't do that. Plymouth Brethren tend to, if there's a group that does it, it's probably them. They tend to have that as a history sign. So that's it.
Well,
Nothing wrong
have we thought about the purpose or what's the benefit of doing it that particular way?
With a meal,
Yes, with a meal.
you get time to fellowship, talk with each other. Everybody, from a physiological side, the poor would get a meal. They didn't always have a full meal at home, so it was a very helpful thing for them, like we saw last week. But the Corinthians perverted that one. But for us today, it would be basically saying, let's put the world on hold and let's gather with the family, let's focus on the Lord and talk with each other. If we got to deal with some relational things, let's deal with that. And it was kind of it could be a self-cleansing time as well as a worship time. But that takes time. And let's face it, in today's world, most people don't have the time to give up a couple of hours to do something like that.
We got time to do a Seder. We could do that.
We only do that at special.
I know, no, but take the time to do it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So,
It's not a matter of not having the time, it's making the time, it's a priority deal. So I'm not against it, I'm for it, but I don't think it's sinful if our church doesn't do that. But could it be a good thing? Yeah. Could it be an interesting experiment to try for a little while? I think that'd be kind of good too.
And my brother over in East Texas, that's way down, their church, the Bible church, they had this meeting and a meal on Monday at lunch.
Creativity.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Now, whether they did broke the bread first or had the meal, I don't know.
Right.
I never attended, but, they did do it every night.
Pascal.
Would you explain Calvin's spiritual blessing?
Yes.
I've heard that a lot recently.
Okay.
Could you repeat the question?
She wants to know if I would explain some of these views, and I said I absolutely will here in about 2 minutes. So why do we observe the Lord's Supper? Obviously, Christ commanded it. Do this, right? In remembrance of me. And it was observed by the early church. Now, Arnie's saying, yeah, but the church said it this way, so if we're going to observe what they did and model it, why don't we model it their way?
Well, what was the purpose of the Lord's Supper? I mean, remember, it's fine. But if a part of our sanctification is growing in fellowship with whom? Other believers or with God our Father?
Well, obviously, it'd be both, and both could take place at the Lord's Supper. Again, it's singling out a time. And again, in the context, you got the poor people, the slaves who are working late, they could come late. It could be a very healing good time, physically and spiritually. But again, we don't think like that because we're program oriented to do it our way and not put people too much time with one.
Well, I just find that when we, at the end of a church service, teaching is done, and we observe Lord's Supper, that it's a very short communion. And sometimes, I mean, in terms of developing a fellowship with my father, I'm not sure it does a good job.
Well, I would not disagree. If you do it every week, it can become a ritual. If you don't do it every week, but every month, but you do it in such a quick way that it's a ritual, that's the same problem. It doesn't appear that that's exactly what the Apostle Paul had in mind with how communion should take place. So, but of course, I don't want to create trouble. So,
What would I want to avoid is eating, and retreating.
meaning what?
Meeting, eating, and retreating.
Yes.
Not going out. and presenting the gospel.
Yeah, we want to go out and present the gospel, but then we want to come and meet to share and tell what happened in my life this week about some of those. What happens in here? We eat, that's not the Lord's Supper, trust me. We eat, and we share what's going on in the church, or we share what's going on out there. That's kind of a microcosm of what the church could and should do. So Pascal had a good question. What are these views? Jews. So transubstantiation, you all have a Catholic background, you know what that is. That's where the priest says a little mumbo jumbo and the elements actually become the body and the blood of Christ. This is mysticism. It can become quasi-idolatry, like other practices in the Catholic Church, and it's wrong. So Martin Luther, being a Catholic and then creating the revolution inside the Reformation, but he wanted to help the Catholic Church reform inside. The Pope wasn't having any of that, so Luther got ticked off and took his Reformation outside. So what do you do with communion? Well, again, Luther was a Catholic who had trouble separating from transubstantiation, even though he knew it was wrong. So he came up with consubstantiation. What does that mean? Well, somehow in and through the elements, Christ is there. What does that mean? I have no idea. But somehow through the elements, Christ is there, so that it's not just regular wine and bread you're eating, there's something special about it. So it's not quite as mystical, but it still is mystical. So that's a Lutheran version. John Calvin, the real presence version, Jesus is really there spiritually. The elements don't transform themselves into something else, but he's really spiritually present there. And then most Protestants would hold to Zwingli view, a Swiss Reformation leader. He would say this is a memorial feast. Now, why would you say that? Do this in remembrance of me. Not drink this because this is my body and blood, because that's more of a metaphor. It's not to be taken literally, that this is literally his body and blood, Catholic Church. But do this in remembrance of me, puts it more into a memorial. Now, I personally hold to the memorial view. I think many Christians do, many Protestants, but a lot of Lutherans and some of the Reformed folk go this different direction. Yeah, David.
Quick personal opinion. First of all, I was infamous in Grace Baptist Church in 1960. Real one. Secondly,
When did we go to juice?
yeah, I don't know. It was before 1965. But I think it's a false dichotomy. So by that I
Between
mean
2 and 4.
between 3 and 4.
Oh, 3 and 4.
In other words, I once upon a time, more recently, went to Andy after years in the community experience. And how would you give us a break between taking of the bread and taking of the wine? Don't rush into this. Is a very personal, contrary to my opinion, very personal clients. I'm never closer to Christ than I am when I physically, logically imagining the body. And I want the peace, I want the bubble around me, I want to be me and him. And when the bread is fine, if reading food, then I'm thinking about the food. Being around people, I'm thinking about that guy who's that's another topic. Personal zone, and I like the way we do it. Pause.
So let me
So to me, that says real presence. Of course, Christ is with us all the time.
Right.
And we remember. I think unnecessary separation.
So here's something that will cause a food fight. Remember the Corinthians, we're not going to get to this yet, but the Corinthians were doing something that was a problem. And Paul said it this way: you are eating the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. Right? Now, what is the nature of the unworthy manner? Was the nature of the unworthy manner the fact that they weren't being quiet and solitude and reflection and prayerful and whatever? Was that the unworthy manner? No. What's the context of the whole discussion? The unworthy manner was, and what does Paul chide them for? The rich got there early and ate all the food. Then they drank all the drink. And some of them were drunk. And then the poor were ashamed when they got there because they had no food. That was the unworthy manner of how they were doing the Lord's Supper, not that they weren't reflecting enough. Now, I think there's room for both of those unworthinesses. I mean, I agree with you at communion. I'd like more quiet, less background music, more time to think, reflect. I got that. But that's not what Paul chides them for. He chides them because the rich got there early and drank and ate, and the poor got there and they sat outside the atrium instead of the inside. They didn't get as much food, and they were made to feel like the have-nots. Paul says that's unworthy of the Lord's Supper. So I understand your view, and I held your view for many, many years, and I still believe that. But contextually, Paul is ripping on them for something they're doing sociologically and socially, which is kind of interesting.
So what is wrong with John Calvin's view?
What is wrong with it? Well, I don't want to say it's wrong, because I agree that when I'm at communion, the Lord he's always there, but am I more perceptive of him at communion? Yes. So in a sense, he's really there, but I really perceive him more during that ordinance. However, he does say, do this in remembrance of me. So that tends to be the memorial. So I definitely don't like number one. I'm not sure I understand number two. I mean, I'm trying to. Three doesn't bug me too much, and four seems to be more normal to me. So
The Lord host. The Lord supper.
he is. Yeah. And the problem is they were focusing on the Lord of the wine.
Calvin.
He is present, but he's always present. See, the transubstantiation people want to say he's not only spiritually present, he's inside the elements. That's how present he is. And that becomes a problem.
The Roman Catholic view as defecating a Lord.
It's a problem. But it's mystical, and it controls people. You think the pandemic is a tool to control people?
Oh, yeah.
The Roman Catholic Church is the ultimate in control of people.
Would you not agree that this church though has ritualized our communion?
This church?
Yes. It's the same you.
So you think I'm going to say on microphone? This way. People turn a good thing into a ritual. The form that the event takes could make it easier to turn it into a ritual. But it's me who determines to turn something into a ritual. And I know the church doesn't want to turn anything into a ritual, and it doesn't want to do it in a way that allows people to turn it into a ritual. So there are ways to make sure that you explain it so that people don't turn it into a ritual. And David's fine about it. Like, give me some more time when we think through, when we break through, do something, maybe do something a little different each time instead of it exactly the same way every time.
Well, that would be my question. How do you avoid ritualizing something you've been doing for a Sunday or month? In the context of the service, there's so much to avoid ritualizing. It's incumbent upon the person receiving the bread and the wine to think through this. I think David is spot on. I agree with Bob that it's a real present element, it's presenter, but you're focused more on that relationship. So I do agree with 3 and 4. I don't see any separate things. I think that's personally that's how I
I kind of see John Calvin's, they're all trying, the first three are trying to compromise the original idea and kind of bring that into the right thing. But I think with Whitley or whatever was, that's the right idea.
Well, I think it's memorial. Christ is always present. I'm perceiving better. But that's truth. But in terms of the ritual, Yeah, there are things that can be done to make sure it doesn't become a ritual, but I mean, there's some churches, they do it every week, and whenever it starts, everybody gets real stiff, quiet, looks really holy and sour, and they get through it quick and then they're done. And to me, yeah, that's a little bit of a ritual. Now, remember this, imagine the church was made up of basically this room. And you were in a big house, and you had a kind of a patio atrium over here, you had the nice bigger room here, and somebody was cooking something. Now, you can facilitate a lot easier with this smaller group than you could with 100, 200, 500, 700, 1,000, 5,000, can you imagine? But you can do everything differently if you're in a house with this kind of a group. But that's not what we've chosen to do in kind of where we live. There are house churches that can facilitate that, but we can't. Now, again, there are some creative things you can do. I doubt that most churches are willing to take that kind of chance. I really doubt our church is, because we are old and we've kind of got our ways and we do what we do, and it would be a risk to take a chance. So, not that I'm advocating it. All right, so you see, you can find over all kinds of stuff, but this is important, right? We've got a model from the early church. We've got Paul's commands that are timeless. The question is, how do we bring over their practice into our presence in the 21st century? Do we have to do it exactly the way they did it, or is it just a general principle? That's where churches kind of struggle. And again, churches like the Catholic Church, they so formalize and ritualize this whole thing that nobody has a chance of deviating anyway, and then the church can control everybody. And me and my natural rebelliousness, I don't like that. And yet I went to a Catholic college. How about that? Imagine how fun that was. So at any rate, now we don't have time, but we will kind of introduce this. He says, this cup, verse 25, is the new covenant in my blood. Now, Paul is going to take us down a very big rabbit trail, which is a really main trail of theology, because he's introducing us to the idea of a covenant. Not just a covenant, it's a new covenant, which implies there's an old covenant. So what is a covenant? So a covenant was a document. It can be used in government, it can be used in a family, a business, all kinds of ways, of basically saying, here is our arrangement. Here is what we agree for our arrangement. So, we're driving here today. For some reason, out of the blue, Marcia said, we really ought to think about redoing our will. So, you have a plan for my life? Because our will's written on a napkin or something. I mean, we had a real one, and we had a paper one, so what? But a will is like a covenant. It's an arrangement, right? It's an arrangement that this is what you do, this is what you don't do, this is gets this, this is gets that. It's an arrangement. So that's what a covenant was. And a covenant involved three parts. It involved the issue of duration. Was it eternal, or was it simply a temporal? Well, the will is temporal, right? After a point, it's temporal. Were there any conditions involved? So was it a conditional covenant, or was it an unconditional covenant? That's a very important piece of information. And then the issue of agency. So was it a unilateral covenant just based on one party, or was it a bilateral agreement or covenant based on two parties, or more than one party, 2 or 3 or 4, or whatever, right? So do we have a unilateral thing, or we have to have a group thing? We see this with NATO and the whole thing going on with the war. Is it a unilateral action? Is it a bilateral action, right? So in a covenant, you had to have this. Now, just to introduce one little thing to get us in trouble. Covenants are vital to understanding the Bible. They are like the backbone of the Bible. Any covenants you can find that God establishes with people. Remember what happened when the flood took place? Everything dispersed. Did you ever notice that you never hear about the fish? Do you? You weren't supposed to take 2 fish of every kind. That wasn't there. And so as you go through that account, it's always about the creeping things and the birds and the animals, and bring this and bring that and bring food for them. All that, that's good. That's good. but you never hear about the fish. I don't understand that. Anyway, later on, he mentioned fish, but he leaves fish out of the whole thing. Anyway, what was the covenant that God made after the flood? It was the bow in the sky. Right? And when you look, you'll see my bow in the sky, my promissory covenant, the rainbow, that I won't do this again to you. So that was God's way of ratifying a covenant. So there are two basic forms that two different theologies that utilize the concept of covenant. One is what we would call covenant theology, which then turns into Reformed theology, which is pretty much built upon the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin, Martin Luther, other people. Then there's what's called dispensational theology, which was started by the Apostle Paul, and then John Darby, and then Louis Berry Chafer, and then John Walford, and then a few other people. And actually, that's what our church bases its theological system on. We are a dispensational church. Why? Because it's in the Bible. It's in Ephesians 1, it's in Ephesians 3. It talks about the dispensations of time and administration. So we're not going to go into all that, except to know that there are two major groups within the Protestant tradition, and they divide themselves over the issue of covenants. So it might be pretty important for us to understand covenants, right? So if you're going down the covenant theology road, you're looking at these three: the covenant of redemption, covenant of works, covenant of grace. But you know what's interesting? Not one of these is actually in the Bible stated that way. They're not there. Theologically, we might be able to put them together and get there, but they're not stated as being there. Now, to me, that's somewhat significant. Now, if you are a dispensationalist, you look at these covenants and you say, are these in the Bible? Oh, yeah, they're in the Bible. It says so. And obviously, the main one is this Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. And God then, out of that covenant, is going to build three other covenants. Clearly, the Davidic covenant, clearly the New Covenant, the Palestinian covenant, some people argue over, but I think it's probably there. So what you have is from the Abrahamic covenant, you have land, seed, and blessing, and from those, you have the other covenants that come through. So understanding covenants from a biblical perspective must be important if here's Jesus saying, my blood is the blood of the new covenant in chapter 22. Paul saying this is the blood of the new covenant, 1 Corinthians 11. Paul talking about new covenant ministry in 2 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 4 and 5. So covenants must be important. Now, most people, and I understand you're not most people, but most people have never, ever thought about or studied covenants in the Bible. And that's too bad, because we're old enough that we should have, and not only studied them, but understood how they fit together. So next week, we'll take a look at a little bit of that and tie it into the issue of the Lord's Supper. So let's pray. Father, thank you that you give us your word. It's not always easy, but you give us your spirit to illuminate truth. So we pray that your spirit in us to do that, and that you would be honored. Lord, help us to be the kinds of people that honor you every day, bring glory to your name. And Lord, help us to make disciples, whether we get to share the gospel, to save the lost, or train the saved. Use us in a way to focus on, we pray in Jesus' name.